This Week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry, is brought to you by Case IH.
Coming up on This Week in Agribusiness, low water levels across the inland waterway continue to drive farmers to market their grain in new ways. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us here for This Week in Agribusiness. I'm Mike Pearson. In the studio this week, we will be hearing from Max Armstrong a little bit later on. Before we do, though, we want to talk about an ongoing issue that's impacting agriculture, and that is low water levels across the inland waterways, most notably across the Mississippi River. Ginger Rousey is a senior writer with Delta Farm Press there in Tennessee. She's been tracking this story for the past 6 weeks. And Ginger, give us an update on the Mississippi this past week. Are there any holdups or slowdowns?
There are some slowdowns still. The good news is we've seen water levels start to come back up. We had quite a bit of rain in our area, so we have seen those levels move up from those record lows that we saw just last week. The bad news is it looks like this could still be a short-lived trend. When you look at long-term forecasts going into late November, those levels are forecasted to drop back off.
Now, Ginger, of course, you're in Tennessee, that mid-Mississippi River area. That's where producers seem to be taking it the hardest. How are elevators and river loaders dealing with the lack of barges?
Well, there's been a lot of slowdowns at those elevators on the rivers, and farmers have really had to call an audible and figure something else out. I spoke with a farmer here in northwestern Tennessee just last week who typically sells his beans and stores his corn. Well, he had to clear out all of his corn out of his grain bins. He had to put the excess corn in bags and then store his soybeans in the bins. And that's something that he's not used to doing. And you kind of hear a lot of these stories of people having to do a lot of extra work to kind of reevaluate what they're doing with their beans as this river issue continues.
Absolutely. It is changing the current accepted practices for a lot of those growers. But Ginger, I understand it's also changing things for operators on the Mississippi. I know you've got connections in the barge industry there. Can you tell us a little bit, how much longer does it take now to get grain from the upper Mississippi down to the Gulf?
Yes, especially there at the beginning of October, as this was really developing and those first closures that had so much backup. A barge captain that I spoke with told me that his typical route from Illinois down to New Orleans may take 8 to 10 days going down the river. This year, it was taking maybe over 2 weeks. And then going back upriver, still expecting about a 30-day trip to get back up the river. So it's taking exponentially longer. They're taking a lot less grain at a time, which is just being compounded in how much slower we can move things down the river. And just the cost, again, we talked about that too, how costly this has become. We saw the cost kind of take a dip in last week's USDA grain transportation report. But still much more costly than we've seen in the past.
And on those costs, Ginger, I know in your conversation there with that barge captain, he ran through some of the costs, but sitting for a day waiting for the river to open up, that gets expensive, doesn't it?
It does. This blew my mind, but just, they to fight the current, to just sit there when they had those closures, 2,367 gallons of diesel fuel burned in one day, going nowhere.
Wow. And given the price of diesel, that is quite a check to have to write to just sit there. Now, Ginger, when we watch barge crews running up and down the river, I don't often see a lot of people on those crews, but I understand it takes labor to move these things. How is hiring in the barge freight? Do they have the staff they need?
Absolutely not. Just like every other industry, it seems like they're having labor shortages just like every other industry. And people are having to move and shift around their schedules, work longer shifts, to make things work. I mean, they're trying their best to get it done. But yeah, I didn't realize this either, but a typical barge crew, maybe about 9 people. So you have a captain, you have a pilot, a co-pilot, you have deck hands, you have a cook on board, to feed you as you're going down the river. So it takes a lot of people when you think about that. And just like every other industry, they are dealing with labor issues as well.
They certainly are. And of course, the slowdowns that these barges are experiencing, it's when they literally can't move. But also, I understand just movement on the river is slowed down. It's a lot more narrow going. Ginger, is that your understanding?
It is. The last I spoke with, because it's gotten so low, and I think, of course, hats off to the Coast Guard, and they're working hard to get this moving. And one thing this barge captain told me, who has been on the river for over 40 years, this may be a record low, but it's still not as bad. The navigation is not as bad as 1981, just because of the work that's been done to keep those channels. But he has noticed as he's coming back up the river that the channels themselves are shifting, and maybe they're having to go move their barges right up against the bank to get things to work. So it's a very unique situation.
It is indeed, and it doesn't look like there's any relief coming in the short term. Ginger, this struggle is going to be with us for some time. Thanks for filling us in on the situation on the Mississippi.